The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 302, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge William Harrison adjusted his black robe as he settled into his large leather chair, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back, and his wire-rimmed glasses perched firmly on his nose. At 62 years old, he had spent the last 15 years building a reputation as one of the strictest judges in the Philadelphia Municipal Court. "Next case," he called out, his voice echoing through the quiet courtroom. His eyes remained fixed on the papers before him, not bothering to look up as the next defendant approached. Sarah Johnson walked confidently to the podium. At 43, she carried herself with natural grace, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue business suit and sensible heels. Her shoulder-length black hair was styled professionally, and her briefcase contained all the necessary documentation to contest her parking violation. Judge Harrison finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed the woman standing before him. "State your name for the record," he said, his tone notably cooler than it had been with the previous defendants. "Sarah Johnson, Your Honor." Her voice was clear and steady, revealing her education and professional background. The judge shuffled through the papers. "Ms. Johnson, you're here contesting a parking violation from March 15th, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. I have evidence that the parking meter was malfunctioning that day. I even reported it to the city's parking authority immediately, and I have the confirmation email right here." Sarah reached into her briefcase to retrieve the documents. Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. "That won't be necessary. The officer's report clearly states the meter was in working order when he issued the ticket." Sarah persisted politely. "Your Honor, if I may, I also have photographs showing the error message on the meter's display, time-stamped from that exact day." In the gallery, several people watched with growing interest. Just minutes earlier, they had witnessed Judge Harrison dismiss a similar case brought by a white businessman, accepting his verbal explanation without requiring any documentation. "Ms. Johnson," the judge's voice carried a hint of irritation, "are you suggesting that our parking enforcement officer filed a false report?" "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply presenting evidence that the meter was malfunctioning when I parked my car. The officer may have arrived after the meter reset itself, which these models are known to do periodically." The judge's fingers drummed against his desk. "I find it interesting that you seem to know so much about parking meters, Ms. Johnson." A few quiet murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The racial undertones in his comment weren't lost on anyone present. Sarah took a deep breath, maintaining her professional demeanor. "I work in real estate development, Your Honor. Part of my job involves understanding city infrastructure and regulations." The court clerk, Maria Rodriguez, who had worked with Judge Harrison for over a decade, watched the interaction with growing concern. She had never seen the judge treat someone with such obvious disdain, especially someone who was so well prepared and articulate. "Well, Ms. Johnson," Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, "regardless of your professional background, the fact remains that you received a ticket for an expired meter. The officer's report stands as evidence. Your claims about a malfunction, without official verification from the parking authority, are merely excuses." Sarah opened her mouth to mention the confirmation email again but thought better of it. Years of experience had taught her when she was facing a losing battle. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "your attitude today suggests a disregard for local ordinances and a lack of respect for this court's time." The gallery fell completely silent. Everyone could see what was happening, but no one dared to speak up. "Therefore, instead of the standard $50 fine, I'm imposing a fine of $500, which must be paid within 30 days. Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sarah stood perfectly still for a moment, her expression neutral despite the obvious injustice. She had faced similar situations before, and experience had taught her that maintaining dignity was the best response. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly, gathering her unused evidence and placing it back in her briefcase. As she turned to leave, she caught the sympathetic eye of Maria, the court clerk, who mouthed a silent "I'm sorry." Sarah gave her a small, knowing smile and walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, her heels clicking steadily against the floor. Behind her, Judge Harrison was already calling the next case, unaware that this encounter would soon come back to challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and his prejudices. Sarah Johnson walked slowly to her car in the courthouse parking lot, the unfair $500 fine notice clutched in her hand. The morning sun had given way to dark clouds, matching her mood perfectly. As she reached her black Mercedes, a voice called out behind her, "Ms. Johnson, please wait." She turned to see Maria Rodriguez, the court clerk, hurrying toward her, holding a manila folder. "I'm so sorry about what happened in there," Maria said, catching her breath. "I've worked with Judge Harrison for 10 years, and I've never seen him be so, well," she struggled to find the right words. "Biased." Sarah offered with a sad smile. "It's okay, you can say it." Maria nodded. "Look, I couldn't say anything in there, but I've been keeping track of his rulings for the past 6 months. She opened the folder, showing Sarah several pages of handwritten notes. There's a clear pattern. White defendants get average fines of $75 for parking violations, while minorities get fined an average of $350. Sarah wasn't surprised, but seeing the actual numbers made her stomach clench. She took out her phone and quickly photographed the pages with Maria's permission. "Thank you for showing me this," Sarah said quietly. "It might come in handy." Back in her office at Johnson Property Management, Sarah sat behind her large desk overlooking the city skyline. Her assistant, Tom, brought in her afternoon coffee and placed it next to the stack of lease renewals waiting for her signature. "Rough morning in court?" Tom asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "You could say that." Sarah picked up the first lease renewal form and froze. There, in clear black text, was the name, William Harrison, apartment 1505, Riverside Luxury Towers. Tom noticed her sudden stillness. "Everything okay with that one?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, a mix of emotions crossing her face. "Tom, remember that judge I told you about? The one who just fined me $500 for a broken meter?" Tom nodded, then his eyes widened as he made the connection. "No way, that's him?" "The very same," Sarah confirmed. "Judge William Harrison has been renting one of our most expensive properties for the past 3 years, and his lease is up for renewal next month." Tom couldn't help but grin. Talk about karma. "So, are you going to?" "Am I going to what?" Sarah interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. "Deny his renewal? Jack up his rent? Treat him the way he treated me?" Tom's grin faded. "Well, when you put it that way." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, watching the city below. "You know, Tom, that's exactly what people like Judge Harrison expect from people like me. They expect anger, retaliation, anything that would confirm their biases." She turned back to her desk and picked up her pen. "But that's not who I am. That's not how I built this company." She began signing the lease renewal, adding a note requesting a personal meeting with the tenant. "You're going to meet with him?" Tom asked, surprised. "I am," Sarah replied, continuing to sign. Sometimes, the best way to fight prejudice is to confront it directly, not with anger, but with dignity and professionalism. Later that afternoon, Sarah's phone rang. It was her mother, calling for their daily check-in. "How did court go, baby?" her mother asked. Sarah told her everything, the unfair treatment, the $500 fine, and the discovery about her tenant. Her mother listened quietly, then sighed. "You know, when I was your age, we couldn't even dream of owning buildings where white folks lived. Now my daughter owns half the luxury apartments in the city." There was pride in her voice, but also concern. "Just be careful how you handle this, Sarah. Men like that judge, when they feel humiliated." "I know, Mama," Sarah assured her. "I'm not looking to humiliate anyone. I just want him to see me, really see me, as a human being." As she finished the call, Sarah's assistant entered with another stack of papers. "The letter has been sent to Judge Harrison's apartment," Tom reported. "The meeting is scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m. Sarah nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation and determination. Tomorrow would be interesting, not just for the judge, but for her too. Sometimes, she reflected, the biggest changes come from the most unexpected situations. Outside her office window, the dark clouds from the morning had cleared, and the late afternoon sun painted the city in shades of gold. Sarah smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own kind of justice, not the kind dealt from behind a courtroom bench, but the kind that comes from forcing someone to confront their own prejudices face to face. Judge William Harrison straightened his tie as he walked into the Riverside Luxury Towers lobby. He had received a letter requesting his presence for a meeting about his lease renewal, which seemed unusual since he had never needed to meet in person before. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. "Good afternoon, Judge Harrison," the front desk security guard greeted him. "Ms. Johnson is expecting you on the top floor." The judge nodded absently, checking his watch. He was exactly 5 minutes early, just as he preferred. As he stepped into the elevator, he wondered why the building's owner wanted to meet him personally. In his 3 years of living here, he had only dealt with the regular management staff. The elevator doors opened directly into a stunning reception area. A young man sat at the desk, whom the judge recognized as Tom from the leasing office. "Judge Harrison," Tom greeted him, his expression carefully neutral. "Ms. Johnson will see you now." As Tom led him through large glass doors into a spacious corner office, Judge Harrison's steps faltered. There, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, was the woman he had found just yesterday. Sarah Johnson turned to face him, wearing a perfectly tailored red business suit, her expression professional and composed. "Good afternoon, Judge Harrison," she said calmly. "Please have a seat." The judge stood frozen for a moment, his mouth slightly open. Tom quietly closed the door behind him, leaving them alone. "You," Judge Harrison managed to say, his face turning pale. "You're the owner of Riverside Towers." "Please, sit down," Sarah repeated, gesturing to one of the leather chairs in front of her desk. "We have some things to discuss." The judge lowered himself into the chair, feeling suddenly small in the large office. Sarah sat down across from him, placing his lease renewal papers on the desk between them. "I must admit," she began, her voice steady, "yesterday was quite interesting. I don't often get to experience both sides of power dynamics so closely together." Judge Harrison's collar felt tight. "Ms. Johnson, he started, but she held up her hand. "Before you say anything, I want to show you something." She opened a folder on her desk. "These are the records of your tenancy here. 3 years of on-time payments, no complaints from neighbors, perfect adherence to all building rules." She looked up at him. "In other words, you've been an exemplary tenant." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Now," Sarah continued, "let me show you my driving record." She pulled out another folder. 20 years of driving, not a single ticket until yesterday. Similar to your tenant record, perfect." Judge Harrison's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. "Ms. Johnson, if this is about yesterday's ruling—" "This is about more than yesterday," Sarah interrupted gently. "This is about assumptions, Judge Harrison. Yesterday, you saw a black woman in your courtroom and made assumptions. Today, you walked into this office and had those assumptions shattered." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "I own this building, Judge Harrison, and not just this one. My company owns 15 luxury properties across the city, including the one where you live. I employ over 300 people. I contribute significantly to this city's economy." Turning back to face him, she continued, "But none of that should matter. Whether I was the owner of this building or someone working an entry-level job, I deserved the same respect and fair treatment in your courtroom." The judge's face had moved from pale to red. "Are you going to terminate my lease?" he asked quietly. Sarah returned to her desk and picked up his lease renewal. "No, Judge Harrison, I'm going to sign it, with no increase in rent." She smiled slightly at his surprised expression. "But I would like something in return." "What would that be?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd like you to spend one day with me, visiting our properties, meeting our employees, and seeing the world through a different lens. I want you to understand that the people who appear in your courtroom are just that, people, each with their own stories, struggles, and successes." She held the lease renewal out to him. "Do we have a deal?" Judge Harrison looked at the paper, then at Sarah's extended hand. In this moment, he saw not just his landlord, but a mirror reflecting back all his prejudices and preconceptions. With slightly trembling fingers, he reached out to shake her hand. "Yes," he said softly. "We have a deal." A week after their meeting in Sarah's office, Judge Harrison found himself sitting in the passenger seat of Sarah's Mercedes. It was 7 o'clock a.m., and the morning traffic moved slowly through the city streets. The judge felt strangely out of place without his black robe and the protection of his courtroom. "Our first stop is Cedar Heights," Sarah explained, navigating through traffic. "It's one of our older properties, but also one of our most important." Judge Harrison nodded silently, noticing how different Sarah seemed in this setting. Confident, relaxed, and completely in control. Gone was the defensive woman from his courtroom. They pulled into a well-maintained apartment complex. Unlike Riverside Towers, this building was simpler, clearly meant for working families. An elderly black man was sweeping the entrance, and his face lit up when he saw Sarah. "Ms. Johnson," he called out warmly. "Didn't expect to see you so early." "Good morning, Mr. Wilson," Sarah replied, giving him a gentle hug. "How's that granddaughter of yours doing in law school?" "Top of her class at Howard University," Mr. Wilson beamed proudly. "That scholarship your foundation provided made all the difference." Judge Harrison watched this interaction with growing interest. There was nothing forced or formal about it, just genuine human connection. Inside the building, Sarah showed the judge around. They met Maria from apartment 3B, a single mother working 2 jobs to put her kids through college. Then there was Mr. Chen in 4A, who had lived there for 20 years and ran a successful restaurant downtown. "You see, Judge Harrison," Sarah said as they walked, "every person here has a story. They're not just names on a lease or faces in a courtroom. They're people with dreams, struggles, and achievements." They visited 3 more properties before lunch. At each stop, Judge Harrison noticed how Sarah knew everyone by name, asked about their families, and showed genuine interest in their lives. During lunch at a small cafe, the judge finally spoke up. "I've been thinking about something," he said, stirring his coffee. "Yesterday, I had a young man in my court. Parking ticket, just like yours. But unlike you, he couldn't afford to pay the fine." Sarah waited patiently as he continued. "I was about to give him the maximum fine, just like I did with you. But then I remembered this was exactly what we would be discussing today, so instead, I listened to his story. Turns out he was parked there because he was delivering food to his elderly neighbor." "And what did you do?" Sarah asked quietly. "I reduced the fine and set up a payment plan," the judge replied. The look of relief on his face, it made me wonder how many others I've hurt with my bias, Sarah finished for him. "It's okay to say the word, Judge Harrison. Acknowledging it is the first step to changing it." After lunch, they visited Riverside Towers, the luxury building where the judge lived. But this time, instead of going to the residence entrance, Sarah took him through the service area. "Meet the people who keep your building running," she said, introducing him to the maintenance staff, housekeepers, and security guards. Many were people of color, working hard to provide the luxury lifestyle the building's residents enjoyed. "James here," Sarah said, pointing to a young black man checking the electrical panels, "is studying engineering at night school. And Mrs. Rodriguez," she nodded toward an elderly Hispanic woman pushing a cleaning cart, "put 3 children through college on her salary from this job." By the end of the day, Judge Harrison sat quietly in his apartment, thinking about everything he'd seen. His phone buzzed, a message from Sarah. "Today was just one day in the lives of the people you saw. Tomorrow, some of them might appear in your courtroom. Remember their stories. Remember their humanity. That's all I ask." The judge walked to his window, looking out at the city lights. He thought about Mr. Wilson's granddaughter studying law, about James working on electrical panels while dreaming of becoming an engineer, about Mrs. Rodriguez's sacrifice for her children's education. For the first time in his career, he realized that true justice wasn't just about following the law. It was about seeing the human being standing before him, regardless of their race or background. He picked up his phone and typed a reply to Sarah. "Thank you for teaching me what my law books never could." The next morning, Judge Harrison sat in his chambers, staring at his reflection in his computer screen. The familiar black robe felt different today, heavier somehow. On his desk lay the court docket for the day, and beside it, a new journal he had bought last night. "Your Honor?" His clerk, Maria Rodriguez, poked her head in. "Are you ready to begin? The courtroom is full today." The judge nodded, picking up his gavel. But before heading to the courtroom, he wrote something in his new journal. "See the person, not just the case." The first case of the day was a traffic violation. A young Hispanic man stood nervously at the podium, his work uniform showing grease stains from what appeared to be an auto repair shop. "Mr. Ramirez," Judge Harrison began, his voice noticeably gentler than usual. "I see you're here for running a red light at 6:30 a.m. last Thursday." "Yes, Your Honor," the man replied, his hands trembling slightly. "I know it was wrong, but my daughter was having an asthma attack, and I was rushing her to the emergency room." 2 weeks ago, Judge Harrison would have dismissed this as another excuse. But today, he remembered James from Riverside Towers, who also worked early morning shifts while pursuing his dreams. "Do you have any documentation from the hospital visit?" the judge asked. Mr. Ramirez quickly pulled out some papers. "Yes, Your Honor. Here's her admission form and the doctor's note." After reviewing the documents, Judge Harrison looked up. "Given the emergency circumstances and your honest presentation of evidence, I'm going to dismiss this ticket. However, I want you to attend a one-day defensive driving course. Even in emergencies, we must think about the safety of others." The relief on Mr. Ramirez's face reminded him of what he had told Sarah about the young man from earlier that week. During the lunch break, Judge Harrison received a surprising visitor. It was Tom, Sarah's assistant, carrying a thick folder. "Ms. Johnson asked me to deliver this to you," Tom said, placing the folder on the judge's desk. Inside, the judge found statistics about racial disparities in traffic court rulings across the country, along with a handwritten note from Sarah. "Knowledge is the enemy of prejudice. I thought you might find this interesting." As he read through the documents, Judge Harrison felt a growing discomfort. The numbers told a clear story of systemic bias in the justice system, a system he had been part of for 15 years. That afternoon, during a case involving a parking violation similar to Sarah's, the judge did something unprecedented. He asked the defendant, an elderly black woman, to explain the circumstances fully before making any judgment. "Your Honor," his clerk whispered after the case, "that's the first time I've seen you spend more than 2 minutes on a parking ticket case." Judge Harrison smiled slightly. "Sometimes, Maria, 2 minutes isn't enough to understand someone's story." After court adjourned, he remained in his chambers, making notes about each case he had heard that day. He noticed patterns in his own previous behaviors that he had never acknowledged before. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "How was your first day back on the bench?" He typed back, "Different. Better, I hope. The statistics you sent, they're eye-opening." Sarah's response came quickly. "Would you be interested in speaking at a judicial bias training session next month? Your recent experience could help other judges understand their own biases." The judge stared at the message for a long time. Part of him wanted to say no, to keep his transformation private. But he remembered Mr. Wilson's granddaughter studying law, and he thought about what kind of justice system she would enter after graduation. "Yes," he typed back. "I think it's time to share what I've learned." As he packed up his things to leave, Judge Harrison noticed his reflection again in his office window. The man looking back at him seemed different from the one who had fined Sarah Johnson just days ago. He wasn't perfect, and he knew he still had much to learn, but he was changing. On his way out, he stopped by Maria's desk. "Could you help me set up a meeting with the other judges? I think it's time we had a serious discussion about our traffic court procedures." Maria smiled, remembering the statistics she had shown Sarah that day in the parking lot. "Of course, Your Honor. I think that's a wonderful idea." 1 month after his day with Sarah, Judge Harrison stood nervously in front of a packed conference room at the Judicial Training Center. 50 judges from across the state sat before him, some looking interested, others skeptical. Sarah sat in the back row, giving him an encouraging nod. "My fellow judges," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "A month ago, I thought I was one of the fairest judges in this city. I was wrong." He clicked to the first slide of his presentation, showing his own courtroom statistics that Maria had collected. The numbers were clear. Defendants of color received fines averaging 4 times higher than white defendants for the same violations. "These are my own records," he admitted, watching surprise spread across many faces. "But my story of transformation begins with a parking ticket and a lesson in humility." As he shared his experience with Sarah, from the unfair fine to discovering she was his landlord, from their day touring properties to his changed perspective, the room grew quiet. Some judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps seeing reflections of their own behaviors. We talk about blind justice, he continued, but too often we're blind to our own biases instead. During the break, an older judge approached him. Bill, I've been on the bench for 30 years. Are you suggesting we've all been doing it wrong? Judge Harrison thought carefully before responding. No, Richard, I'm suggesting we can all do better. I know I needed to. Sarah watched these interactions from a distance, noting how different Judge Harrison seemed from the man in her courtroom just weeks ago. His shoulders no longer carried that rigid authority. Instead, he showed a new kind of strength, the strength to admit mistakes and grow from them. After the presentation, Judge Harrison received an unexpected visit in his chambers from the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. Harrison, the Chief Justice said, sitting down heavily, "Your presentation today, it's caused quite a stir." Judge Harrison straightened in his chair. "Sir, I understand it might have made some people uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable is exactly what we need right now," the Chief Justice interrupted. "I want you to head a new committee on judicial bias and reform. We need to look at this systemically, across all courts." That evening, Judge Harrison sat in his apartment at Riverside Towers, looking out at the city lights. His phone rang. It was his daughter, Claire, a law student in her final year. "Dad, my professor just showed us a video of your presentation," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I've never been more proud to be your daughter." The judge felt tears forming in his eyes. "I just wish I had learned these lessons sooner, sweetheart." "But you learned them, Dad. That's what matters." After hanging up, he walked down to the building's maintenance area, something he had never done before his day with Sarah. James, the engineering student, was checking the electrical systems. "Evening, Judge Harrison," James said, surprised to see him there. "James, I remember you mentioned studying engineering. How are your classes going?" The young man's face lit up, and they spent the next 15 minutes discussing his studies. As Judge Harrison headed back to his apartment, he received a text from Sarah. "Heard about the new committee. Congratulations. Change starts with one person willing to speak up." He replied, "Thank you for being the catalyst for that change." That night, Judge Harrison added to his growing journal. He wrote about the presentation, the committee appointment, and his conversation with James. At the bottom of the page he added, "Justice isn't just about following laws. It's about seeing people, really seeing them." As he got ready for bed, he thought about tomorrow's docket. Among the cases was another parking violation, but this time he knew he would handle it differently. He would listen, really listen, to the person standing before him. His last thought before falling asleep was about how one parking ticket and one remarkable woman had changed not just his perspective, but potentially the entire state's judicial system. Sometimes, he realized, the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. 6 months after the judicial training presentation, Sarah Johnson sat in her office reviewing the latest report from the Court Bias Reform Committee. The changes were remarkable. Under Judge Harrison's leadership, the committee had implemented new guidelines for traffic court across the state, requiring judges to document their reasoning for all fines above the minimum amount. Her phone buzzed with a text from Judge Harrison. "Turn on Channel 5 News. Something you might want to see." Sarah switched on the office television just in time to see Judge Harrison standing at a podium outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters. "Today," he announced, "our state becomes the first in the nation to require implicit bias training for all sitting judges. This initiative wouldn't exist without the courage of one person who showed me my own prejudices through grace and dignity rather than anger." Tom rushed into Sarah's office. "Ms. Johnson, you need to see this. Judge Harrison is on TV talking about." "I'm watching," Sarah said softly, touched by the public acknowledgement. The news segment continued with statistics showing the impact of the changes Judge Harrison had implemented in his own courtroom. Traffic fines had become more consistent across racial lines, and community trust in the court system had improved significantly. Later that afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected visitor, Maria Rodriguez, the court clerk who had first shown her the bias fine statistics. "Ms. Johnson," Maria said, holding a thick folder, "I thought you'd want to see this. We've been tracking all judges' rulings since the new guidelines went into effect. The changes are incredible. Sarah invited Maria to sit down and together they reviewed the numbers. Racial disparities in fines had decreased by over 70% across all participating courts. But that's not all, Maria continued excitedly. Remember James from your maintenance staff? Judge Harrison wrote him a recommendation letter for an engineering scholarship. He got it. Sarah smiled, remembering the young man's dedication. Sometimes small actions create big ripples, she said. That evening, Sarah attended a community meeting where Judge Harrison was speaking to local residents about the court system changes. The room was packed with people from all backgrounds, many of whom Sarah recognized as tenants from her various properties. During the question and answer session, an elderly black woman stood up. Judge Harrison, I was in your court 2 years ago. You fined me $400 for a broken tail light I was trying to save money to fix. Last week, my grandson was in your court for the same thing. You listened to him and helped him find a program to get it fixed for free. What changed? The judge looked directly at Sarah before answering. I learned that behind every case is a human story, and my job is to listen to those stories before making judgments. After the meeting, Sarah and Judge Harrison walked through the courthouse parking lot together, the same lot where this story had begun 6 months ago. You know, the judge said, stopping near Sarah's car, my daughter Claire graduates from law school next month. She's changed her career plans because of all this. Oh, Sarah raised an eyebrow. Instead of corporate law, she's going to work with the Equal Justice Initiative. She says her father's transformation inspired her to fight systemic bias in the legal system. Sarah smiled. The next generation learning from our mistakes and doing better, that's how real change happens. They reached Sarah's car, and she turned to face him. Judge Harrison, when I first revealed I was your landlord, I could have used that power to humiliate you or seek revenge. But that would have only reinforced the stereotypes you held. The judge nodded solemnly. You chose to educate rather than retaliate. That choice didn't just change me, it's changing our entire judicial system. As Sarah drove home that evening, she thought about how a simple parking ticket had sparked such significant change. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. Baby, I just saw the judge on the news. Your daddy would have been so proud of how you handled this. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she typed back, Thanks, Mama. I learned from the best. You always said education beats confrontation. That night, as both Sarah and Judge Harrison prepared for bed in their respective homes, neither could have imagined that their story would soon become a case study in judicial training programs across the country, a powerful example of how personal transformation could lead to systemic change. 1 year after the parking ticket incident, the grand ballroom of the City Convention Center was filled to capacity. The occasion, the first annual Justice and Equity in Law Enforcement Conference, jointly organized by Sarah Johnson's newly established Foundation for Equal Justice and Judge Harrison's Judicial Reform Committee. Sarah stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd. In the front row sat Judge Harrison with his daughter Claire, now a practicing civil rights attorney. Next to them was James, who had graduated with his engineering degree and now managed technical operations for all of Sarah's properties. A year ago, Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. A parking ticket changed not just 2 lives, but an entire system. Today, we're here to ensure that change continues. She gestured to a large screen behind her, which displayed statistics from the past year, a 85% reduction in racial disparity for traffic violations, over 200 judges trained in bias recognition, and 15 other states adopting their reform model. Judge Harrison was next to speak. As he walked to the podium, he looked different from the stern judge of a year ago. His face was softer, his smile genuine, his shoulders relaxed. My journey began with a mistake, he admitted to the crowd. But Ms. Johnson turned that mistake into an opportunity for growth. Today, I'm proud to announce that our state's Supreme Court has unanimously approved mandatory bias training for all court employees, from judges to security officers. During the lunch break, Sarah found herself sitting with an unexpected group. Judge Harrison, Claire, Maria Rodriguez, now the head court clerk, Tom, James, and Mr. Wilson from Cedar Heights, whose granddaughter had just passed the bar exam. You know what's funny? Maria said, looking around the table. That parking meter that started all this, it really was broken. The city repair logs proved it 6 months later. Everyone laughed, but Judge Harrison shook his head. That broken meter fixed something far more important: my broken perspective. Later that afternoon, Sarah led a workshop on property management and housing discrimination. She shared how her own experiences had shaped her business practices, ensuring that her properties remained accessible to people from all backgrounds while maintaining high standards. Success shouldn't be a gated community, she told the attendees. Sometimes, all people need is a fair chance. After the conference, Sarah and Judge Harrison stood in the empty ballroom, looking at the banners and displays that told their story. "My lease is up next month," the judge said suddenly. Sarah smiled. "Planning to renew?" "Actually," he replied, "I'm moving to a smaller apartment in Cedar Heights. Claire suggested it would help me stay connected to the community I serve." "Mr. Wilson will be thrilled," Sarah said. "He's been wanting someone to play chess with in the evenings." That night, both Sarah and Judge Harrison received emails from the state governor's office. Their program was being recommended as a national model for judicial reform. Attached was a formal invitation to present their story at the National Justice Conference in Washington, D.C. Sarah forwarded the email to her mother with a simple message: "Look how far a parking ticket can go." Her mother's response brought tears to her eyes. "Baby, you didn't just fight injustice, you transformed it. That's what real leaders do." The next morning, Sarah stood in her office, looking out at the city skyline. On her desk sat two items: the original $500 parking ticket and a framed photo from the conference showing her and Judge Harrison cutting the ribbon to open the new Community Justice Center. Her assistant Tom knocked on the door. "Ms. Johnson, the new batch of judicial training materials is ready for your review." And Judge Harrison called. "He wants to discuss expanding the program to include police departments." Sarah picked up the old parking ticket and smiled. "You know, Tom, sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. We just have to be brave enough to turn those moments into movements." As she sat down to review the materials, Sarah thought about all the lives that have been touched by this story. From James achieving his engineering dreams to Claire finding her true calling in civil rights law, from Mr. Wilson's granddaughter passing the bar to Judge Harrison moving to Cedar Heights. The parking ticket that had once seemed like an injustice had become a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger or revenge, but the patient, persistent work of education and transformation, and in the end, that made all the difference.